Well, it's important to identify the broader socioeconomic context of poverty, inequality, and failures in governance driving the recent unrest. That's according to Nomfundo Mogapi from the Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation. She is their executive director. Let's chat to her now just to gauge her thinking around what we've seen, what we've experienced. Nomfundo, good afternoon, and thanks so much for your time. So let's talk about why it is important to identify what drives behavior like we saw over the past week or so.
Thank you so much. Just a quick correction. It's now the CEO of the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership. I was at CSVR, and partly the reason why I started funding this organization is an appreciation that trauma affects everything in South Africa, including the violence. And that if we are to succeed in winning some of the struggles that we have in our society, we have to look at how we can use these trauma-informed approaches. For example, the whole issue of poverty. If we use trauma-informed approaches, we begin to appreciate that we are a country that has a history of historical, collective, and transgenerational trauma. And when people are in a state of poverty, for them, it's not just about being poor, but it's the sense that they are re-experiencing the very same trauma that their fathers and forefathers have struggled with. And therefore, getting out of poverty brings this sense of urgency at an emotional level where people want to get out of that state. So it's really important to integrate psychological approaches and explanations as we try to understand what's happening in our country and how best to respond.
And I think many people, and the sentiment you heard is this week, is why resort to this kind of violence. It wasn't just the looting. It wasn't just, the sort of taking of whether it was groceries and all the pictures we've seen. It was the actual intent to destroy. It was the burning. It was the destruction that we actually saw. And that is what has left people, it is very difficult to buy into that people do this because they are hungry and because they're poor.
Until you fully appreciate what has happened to us as a society, the depth of destruction and devastation that people feel at a psychic level on a daily basis when they are hungry. It's not just about hunger, right? It's not just about hunger. It's about the daily humiliations that those that don't have in our society experience. When they go into hospitals, they must wait long queues. When they go into police stations. So what we are seeing, which you are describing so powerfully, the destruction, is really an externalization of the deep-seated wounding that people have actually gone through. And so that is on the one hand an expression of that. But also secondly, when I was still at CSVR, we kept on saying that the ones that are elite or the ones in power or even leadership in South Africa are unable to see these hidden wounds, these day-to-day struggles that those that don't have actually have. We tend to only listen when there is violence in our country. And we've been saying this, that if we don't deal with these root causes, every time the collective violence comes, the cost becomes higher and it escalates more. And that's exactly what we've seen today in the past week. And that's why I've been saying that what has been happening in the past week is because there was a trigger. Yes, President Zuma and him going to prison was a trigger. And if we appreciate that it was a trigger, then we have to understand that in the future there might be another trigger. After we've dealt with this whole thing, we can't go back again as a country as we usually do. When there's violence, we all panic, we go and help, and then we go back to the way we live. There is no sufficient change in our socioeconomic architecture, in our leadership architecture, and also for us in the elite to really say, how do we begin, yes, to accumulate our wealth, but at the same time pull up the people that are struggling and still live in poverty.
And you're right. I mean, the common sentiment out there is that this was a ticking time bomb. It was just a fuse waiting to be lit, and that is what happened. But I suppose we could debate, and many saying, yes, not all of those who looted were hungry, they were criminals. And yes, once we get to the bottom of all of this and who instigated all of this, Nomfundo, we can start to look at that further. But I suppose it's important now is, what are our lessons learned? What do we do with what has happened?
Definitely. I think it's a really important period for us to not just respond from the space of panic, to sit in and saying, what is this that this is telling us as a society, and going forward, how do we not come back here? it has really been encouraging to see the hashtag Rebuild South Africa, Restore South Africa, to see the social cohesion that has emerged. I would like to appeal as a psychosocial expert who's been working with issues of trauma for the past 21 years in our country, that can we also use this as an opportunity to understand that if we don't deal with our trauma first amongst our leaders, a lot of our leaders across all sectors are the very same people that were involved in the struggle. And the strategies that they use to help us to win the struggle are not the same strategies that work when you are now in power and in leadership. So a simple thing like the one that you are saying, our capacity to not just only listen to see the criminals and call people hooligans, but to actually sit with the pain of the masses that were easily mobilized towards this violence is going to be critical. So we need to look at how do we heal as leaders so we can respond, not from the space of trauma, but how do we facilitate healing of our wounds? We need to go back and do community-based transitional justice and healing again in our society.
And just from what you've seen, are the leaders we have now, who many felt have let them down? I think many people in South Africa feel they let them down in the past week. Are they capable of leading that process or being part of that process, or does that need to change as well?
Look, I've seen some encouragement in certain pockets of our leadership where there is now an understanding that taking our wounds and putting them under the carpet and saying that we are focusing on rebuilding the society is actually not going to help. And that as leaders, we are the vehicle that will facilitate this healing. So I do think that it's really encouraging that there are some of this work. I have been also saying that we need to have psychosocial advisors working with our leaders. You know, when I was working at CSUR, I always used to say that it is irresponsible for anyone in South Africa to enter in a position of leadership or management without working on themselves. So the hope is that we know we've done studies in the field of trauma for the past 10 years. It takes just a few sessions for our psyche to shift towards facilitating social cohesion and efficacy as a society. And I just hope that we will have more and more leaders that pause and listen and understand that their greatest work is not just a political agenda, but it is their own healing. Because when they are better healed, they can facilitate the healing processes in our country. And I do hope that some of them are actually listening now as we are talking in eNCA, and they can reach out to the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership and many other people in our country that are pushing and saying we need to deal with trauma. It's no longer in our private rooms, but we need to integrate it in transforming our policies, our systems, and also how we lead.
Well, thanks very much for that. They're very, very important to look ahead and how we use this. That's Nomfundo Mogapi from the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership.